Okay. All right. Kathi Kresol's obsession is history, and she has been feeding this passion while researching Rockford's history for over a decade. Kathi loves the opportunity to share this passion through the stories she writes for her column, Voices from the Grave, in the Rock River Times, and the stories she tells on her haunted Rockford tours. She serves on the board of the Rockford Historical Society, has worked at the Rockford Public Library for years, and loves sharing her enthusiasm for history and reading in any way possible. Along with researching and writing about history, Kathi has given presentations on true crime cases, paranormal encounters, and Rockford history. She has also been interviewed for several radio shows, local newscasts, and newspapers, and always considers it an honor to share the stories of the men, women, and children who have called this area home. Welcome, Kathi. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. I will go ahead and share my screen so everybody can see my PowerPoint. So thank you, Nicole, for inviting me to speak today. Very excited to be here with you guys today. And, you know, it's my favorite time of the year. So I'm hoping, my goal is with this, that maybe that you'll be, you know, intrigued enough to maybe hit the road a little bit. I know people aren't celebrating Halloween in the usual way, and I'm not doing my own bus tour. So I'm hoping that this will intrigue you enough to get out and maybe stop at a couple places to see these, and then you can remember the stories. So to that note, we'll get started. So the first story that I chose for this evening is The Revenge of Big Thunder. This takes place in the Belvedere area, Belvedere, Illinois. Big Thunder was a chief of the Potawatomi tribe, and he lived in our area in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And this is a statue that they have for him in Belvedere. This is his actual burial place. It sits on the courthouse square. When I discovered this story, it was behind some bushes. You can barely see it. I had to actually stand in the bush to hold the things down, but I think they've cleared it out now. So Big Thunder knew his time was growing short. He had had visions of his own demise, and he grew frightened for his people because he had a vision that there would be another great war between his tribe and another tribe. So he asked them to do something a little unorthodox. And instead of putting him in a burial mound or in a tree, he asked them to build like a bench and sit him up so that he could be on the lookout for this group of people that were going to come and take their land. He also had them put with his favorite weapons and tobacco in his lap. Now, unfortunately, they chose an area that was right on the stagecoach line at the time. And some of the people got a little curious. They built like a little stockade around Chief Big Thunder. And the people were waiting for the stage. They'd walk up to the top of the hill and they would peek over the fencing and they would see this man sitting there. So first it was kind of a lark. People would dare each other to steal some tobacco. But then, unfortunately, it led to the taking of his bones. I don't know why somebody would want that as a souvenir. I'm fine with a postcard, but these guys were not, so they took something a little more. And the people who were running the stagecoach that stop were smart people, and they realized that this is kind of a big deal to come and see Chief Big Thunder. So they started replacing his real bones with pig bones. And I actually saw a picture that somebody had it mounted and put under glass, that his femur, his leg bone. And it actually said, you know, bones from an Indian chief. So the Native Americans would come back and pay honor to their chief every once in a while, even after they left the land. So they were mortified to see that the travelers were taking parts of his bones. So they cursed anybody who ended up with these bones. Now, fast forward to a few years later, Josiah Goodhue, who lived in Chicago at the time, was riding into this area to check it out. He wanted to see about expanding and coming here. And he did decide to move with his family. He was working at the Rush Medical Center in Chicago. He helped settle Chicago. He helped design the city seal. So he was the perfect person to come and help us be a little more civilized, if you will, place. And him and his wife moved their 13 children. They had some that died in the Chicago area, but they brought their large family to Rockford, and he started out as serving as a doctor here. And unfortunately, Josiah decided to take Big Thunder's skull. Now, that he might have been looking at it from a medical standpoint, that, you know, it was different than a white man's skull, so he wanted to study it. I can hope that. But he took it, and it had some bad consequences for him. On December 31st, 1847, Josiah was working with a patient here in Rockford, well, about 4 miles out of town, actually. And, you know, people had been teasing him about this curse, and he laughed it off. But that night, as he was leaving, he had been working with a nurse at this patient's house, and he walked her home like a gentleman should. And he didn't realize that they were digging a new well, and he fell in this well, and he ended up dying. They got him out of it, but he passed away thereafter. So this is a picture of Josiah. I love his rocking hair in this one. And then his tombstone, which is at Cedar Bluff Cemetery. They buried him there in Cedar Bluff because he gave the Cedar Bluff Cemetery its name. And at that time, he could see, overlook the city that he had helped name. He changed it from Midway. He was part of that movement that changed Rockford's name from Midway to Rockford. So unfortunately, he did a lot of good, but he was more well known for the way he died than the way he lived, which I always think is a shame, because he was a doctor and he helped a lot of people. But this curse was a big deal back then. Our next story takes place in the very small town of Garden Prairie. I was amazed at this story. This story not only involved Garden Prairie, it went international. So it made the detective magazines, you know, when they were real big. And so with Garden Prairie, it's a story of Daniel Stott. He was, he worked for the train company there in Garden Prairie, and he lived not too far from the little train depot. And he was in his 60s, and he had his wife had taken ill, and they hired a nurse for her. And this young lady's name was Julia. And Julia and Daniel hit it off, and so when his wife passed away, she stayed on and as his housekeeper, and then eventually they were married. So Julia was 33 at the time of this story. The story takes place in 1881. Julia had come from Chicago, and so Daniel was older, and he he wasn't really unhealthy, but he had epileptic seizures. So Julia had introduced him to a doctor from Chicago, Dr. Neil Cream, and he was treating him with this medication that seemed to be helping Daniel with his seizures. So this is Daniel's house. It still stands there in Garden Prairie. Definitely some vibes with this house. So Daniel started run out of his medication, and he asked Julia to go into Chicago and pick him up some more. So she would take the train into Chicago, spend the night, and then come back to Garden Prairie. So she brought back the medication, and on June 12th of 1881, she got in that morning, mixed it up for Daniel, and he took it. And within 20 minutes, Daniel Stott was dead. Now, everybody figured, you know, well, old Dan, he was not unhealthy. You know, he probably had a seizure and passed away during the seizures. So he had been under Dr. Cream's care for about 6 months at the time of his death. And so they buried Daniel, and that should have been the end of it. But lo and behold, shortly after his death, the coroner who was Frank Whitman at the time in Garden Prairie, got a letter from Dr. Cream stating that he had some suspicions about Daniel, that he had ordered his pills from this company, and he was thinking that maybe the doctor should exhume Daniel's body and take the stomach contents and feed it to a stray dog and see what happens. He said, I have some suspicions about this. So Dr. Whitman did that, and within 20 minutes after they fed the dog started vomiting, and then he died. So then they sent Daniel's stomach to Rush Medical in Chicago to get autopsy to see what was going on with it. And turns out they decided to question Julia while they were waiting for the results of this test. Julia crumbled right away, said that she had been having an affair with Dr. Cream. And in fact, they had been lovers all along. And she had come to work with Daniel under the guise of that this was going to be a scheme that they were running, a kind of insurance scheme. Dr. Cream would treat Daniel, Daniel would die, and then Dr. Cream would sue the company for accidental poisoning kind of thing, the drug company. Well, it didn't work out quite like the couple planned. Here's Dr. Cream. He was very handsome, very persuasive, and young Julia definitely was infatuated with him. So they put Dr. Neil on Cream. He's found guilty, and put Dr. Cream on trial. He is found guilty, and they put him away in 1881. So he is released in 1891, and he had gotten some inheritance while he was serving in prison, and he left, and he went to England. Shortly after he got to England, the young prostitutes in town started to pass away. One of them lasted long enough for them to question her, Matilda, and she told them that she had been given some medicine from this Dr. Cream, who guaranteed that she wouldn't get pregnant if she took these pills. So she took the pills, and then she died. So they did all the autopsy on her, found out she had strychnine poisoning as well, just like Daniel. And they did put Dr. Cream on trial. He was found guilty, and in 1892, they executed Dr. Cream. They didn't mess around in London with putting him in jail. They went ahead and executed him. Another little mystery of this story was that Dr. Neil Cream, when they put the noose around his neck, he said, "I am Jack the," and then they pulled the lever, and that was the end of Dr. Cream. So we'll never know. He might have been going to say he was Jack the Ripper. But it looks like if he would have realized that the record showed that he was in prison during that time when Jack the Ripper was killing women in England. Also, there was another little mystery. Daniel's grave didn't have a tombstone on it for a very long time. And then all of a sudden it did. And it was overnight kind of thing. And the tombstone, as you can see, this is the old picture, has the Masonic symbol on it. He was a Mason, and they figure that the Masons are the one who put this on his grave. Kind of a strange little epitaph there. It says it's poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream on the actual tombstone. And it's really funny. If you go to Little Garden Prairie Cemetery, you will see that it's still, his name is almost completely gone off of the stone now, but it does still say, and I know people say, oh, it's the rain wearing away, it falls down and, you know, falls on the top part of the stone, but it's still kind of cool that you can still read really clearly that he was poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream. The next story takes place in Rockford. The Ennet family, again, I was completely surprised by this story. The Ennet family lived in Rockford. Thomas Ennet came from the Isle of Man in England. He had learned to be a stonemason there. And he brought his lovely wife here to town. And then they started a construction company, basically a mason stone company, and he arrived in 1853. So then he continued his trade, and he built things like the original St. Mary's Catholic Church, the St. James Catholic Church, and the First Presbyterian Church, many businesses. He married his wife Ellen in 1857. Now they had 10 children together, and unlike other people of the time period, all of Thomas and Ellen's children lived to adulthood, which was very unusual for the time period. Thomas built them a very distinctive home, and some of you are going to recognize this. It is actually on North 2nd and Market Street. It is now apartments, but at that time it was a single family home. Excuse me, I had to get some tea. So they settled in this house, and at that time, one of their sons was working for the fire company, but he would help out at the Ennet and Sons contracting as well. So this house at that time had a barn behind it, and Thomas owned several of the properties around the area. And his oldest son, George, would help him out by taking care of the extra properties. Now, George was like a man's man. He was a hunter. He helped, he had lots of friends. He loved to go hunting and talk and be real social. But unfortunately, a few years before this story took place, George had a really bad accident. He had fallen from a height and smacked his head on a stone fence in the yard. And he hit the front of his head. And after that, George, his whole demeanor changed. He would get quiet and kind of moody, and only his sister, Anna, could get him out. Anna and him were very, very close. So she would able to tease him kind of out of his bad moods. Unfortunately, Ellen had some mental issues and would spend time in and out of the mental hospital. Anna and the two other, her sister Nellie, would take care of the family, and they helped raise the other children. And Anna kind of took the role of the mother. And Thomas had an office in his home, but he also had a construction site where they worked out of. So big family, lots going on. Ellen passed away on January 28, 1897 in the home. They had her funeral. And and Anna just continued to care for the family. So Thomas actually, now that the children were older, he could travel. He traveled a little bit, and the boys ran the company, and the girls kept the home. So everything was wonderful in the Ennet family up until August 16th. And August 16th was like any other day in the Ennet family, and they had their noon meal, and at the dinner, Thomas gave the boys assignments for the day, and he asked George. There had been a really bad storm the night before, and he asked George to go to this property that was close to the house, and clean up all the mess from the debris that was in the yard from this bad storm. And Nellie, his other younger sister, was helping him, and they were teasing back and forth. He seemed in good spirits. So at the lunch, he said fine. He went up to change from his nice clothes that they were expected to eat the meals in to his work clothes. Nellie and Anna were having a maid help them in the basement area. The basement area is where they did the wash. Now, you can't see it from this particular picture, but there is a staircase on the side of the house, on the left side as you're looking at it. And under that staircase is an entry to the basement right there. And they had it all open because it was a warm day. So they were down there washing, and Anna and Nellie were in the basement with this woman, and she was, putting the clothes through the wringer. Another sister, Mary, was up in her room sewing, and Thomas walked up to his office to do some paperwork before he went back to his main office. Later on, Nellie would report that she heard someone coming down the stairs, very heavy-footed, one stair at a time. And then she said she heard an explosion. She dropped to the ground. The room filled up with smoke, and she began to scream. She crawled out of that side doorway and went out into the street, screaming her father's name, or screaming for her father. He ran out to see what was going on. The neighbors came running, and Thomas, she said that Anna was still inside. So he ran back in the house, and he just looked in the room quickly, the laundry room, but he didn't see anything. It was still full of smoke. So he started up at the top floor. He ran all the way up, and he started going room by room through the house looking for everybody. Mary was silently sitting by her sewing machine. She didn't know what had happened. Smoke was billowing out of the basement at this time, and more neighbors were coming. It was very chaotic. Thomas made it all the way back down to the laundry room. And the neighbor man, Mr. Poisson, was standing in the entryway of the basement. There were two rooms, and he was standing between them. The laundry room was on one side, and another room was on the other. And he just shook his head and looked down at the ground, and Thomas walked into the laundry room, and there he saw on the floor Anna. She had been shot at the back of her head, and it had disfigured her face horribly. And the neighbor said what really drew his attention was her hands, because you couldn't recognize her by her face. But it said that her hands, who had toiled so hard for the family, now lay still in death. Thomas also looked at the neighbor, and the neighbor pushed open the side door. There had actually been two shots, though in the confusion, Thomas later said he really had only heard the first one. George had gone into that room after he fired, and he had fired twice into the one room, and then he went into this room and fired again. He took off his shoe and his sock, and he sat down on a chair, put the gun between his legs, and pulled the trigger with his toe and blew off his head. Nobody knows why George did this. He had not given any indication of being upset with the girls. Nobody really knows. Now I'm going to go back to their tombstone. Him and Anna are buried next to each other, and that bothered me for a little while. But on one of my tours, when we were at the house, the psychic said that that's the way Anna would have wanted it. She loved her brother. She took care of her brother. Unfortunately, there are some moments that are trapped in that house. The moment that George walked down the stairs, when they looked at his body later, he had enough shotgun shells in his coat pocket to finish off the family. And they wondered why he stopped. He obviously tried to kill both girls because he shot twice. When Thomas went back into the room, the poor woman that was helping them with the laundry was in shock, and she was just running the ringer over and over and over again. Nellie got out okay, but she was devastated, obviously, for the whole family was. And after this, it was kind of like the Kennedys. It's one thing bad after another happened. The only one who really had a good life was Nellie. She would end up having made some really good choices, but the family sort of fell apart after this horrible tragedy. Like I said, the psychic said that she wouldn't be surprised if people heard footsteps all the time, lights going on and off because of the energy of what happened in this home. It's a beautiful home. It's a shame that that happened. I'm hoping that whoever lives in this home isn't too scared. I haven't got any calls about it, so I just only know what the psychic said, that George still hangs around there. And she said there's a loop, like a residual haunting of Nellie coming up out of the stairs, and she could just hear the screaming. She was just standing by that street, just holding her head, and she's like, all I can hear is screaming. So that plays like a loop in that area. The Top Shop tragedy, another horrible thing. Mildred Kramer was 20 years old in 1926. She had actually worked at the Burpee Seed Company. Her father asked her to get another job because a piece of dirt had flown in her eye and caused a really bad infection, and they almost had to take her eye. So he wanted her to get a different job that was a little safer. She went to this Top Shop to get a job, and they were actually expanding, and they hadn't hired women before. She was one of the first women hired there, and they would take cellophane and sew it to canvas to make tops for cars and golf carts and stuff like that. So she was really excited about it. She was going to work the second shift. And on May 26th, she goes to her job, and two other women were starting that day. They had only been in the building about a half an hour. The way that the shop was set up, there were men who had really large saws down on the first floor, and then the women were on the second floor with the sewing machines. There were boys that were hired to run and pick up the extra cellophane pieces. This was a petroleum-based product, and when they cut it, some of the sparks could fly into it, so they were supposed to keep it up. Well, one of the boys had gotten behind, and a couple sparks did fly into the pile, and it started on fire. Black smoke billowed up, and unfortunately, right up the stairs where the women were. There were 16 women on the second floor at this time. Like I said, two of them had only been in the building for half an hour. They hadn't even finished their paperwork for being hired. And the two men that owned the Set and Top Shop were brothers, and one of them was an alderman at the time of that area. They tried to get in to help the women. They couldn't get to the second floor. The flames were too high and the smoke was too thick. There was a woman who did become quite the hero that day. She, her name was Spinkbeiner, and she led some of the women out. She threw a piece of wood to the adjoining building and had the women go across this little tiny board to safety. Other women were jumping out of the windows trying to get to safety. One lady was actually on fire, and when she jumped out, she landed in a car parked below, and it started everything on fire. But two men happened to be there watching, and they put the fire out and got her to the hospital. Here's a picture after the fire. 5 women died instantly in this. The air was so bad that cellophane had a chemical reaction, and they breathed it in, and they died where they stood. And unfortunately for Mildred, she was one of them. She was the youngest victim. Where the X, or the little crosses, is where the bodies were found later when they went in to take them out. These are the victims. Mildred is the one up in the left corner. She's buried at Cedar Bluff Cemetery as well. They said that the coroner went in himself. These women were burned so badly that he was afraid that it would be too difficult to get their bodies out completely. So he went in himself. Coroner Olson, I'm sorry, Fred C. Olson was the coroner at this time, and he went in and he got the women out. And they said that you could have heard a pin drop when he was loading these bodies into the wagons to go to his offices to get autopsied. Mildred's father, who had, enticed her, encouraged her to get a different job to be safe, this devastated him and his wife. It took them over a half an hour, him and his brother, to identify Mildred. And it really was more of a process of elimination. There was one woman, you can see the picture there. They don't have a picture of one of Lily. Mary Lily's doesn't have a picture, but her children were all here, and they were all left with their husband, 8 of them. There was another one that had 6 children, and they were left orphaned, and her brother couldn't care for her all, so the children were all split up and sent to different places. Now, the strange thing, this whole story is odd, but the strange thing about this is Mildred Kramer, people, when they go to that area, it's on the corner of Elm and Church Street. There is a bust there of Lincoln. It was up on Elm just a little bit further from that intersection. And the first time I took my psychic, Sarah Bowker, there, she said, I don't know what's going on, but I smell smoke. And then when we were in the cemetery doing the walk, I did not tell her where we were going. And she said that she smelled smoke. And at the cemetery, some people say that cemeteries aren't haunted, but at least they come through when we're there. I go out and invite them to come to Sarah and tell them her story, or tell her their story. So sometimes they come through. And Mildred's father definitely is there. He can't rest because of what happened with his daughter. He didn't, he only wanted the best for her, and it turned out awful. He would sue the company, and they got $1,600, but he did it just so that they would make the next place safer, and it worked. They rebuilt, they opened up even bigger than before, but the 2 brothers worked with the families and made the new factory very safe. So some good did come out of it, but he still can't rest. So I get stories in all different kinds of ways, and I have been told many, many times about this woman who walks downtown. She's seen in a long white gown. If anybody has studied any folklore, there is such a thing as called the La Lorna, or the weeping woman. And she usually has something to do with a child. And she's either searching for the child, or something happened to the child. And so I have been trying to figure out who this woman in white downtown is. She's seen at the Coronado. She's been seen around, like I said, walking along the river. She's always dressed in an older style, long white gown, and she has her hair up in a bun. One story that I came across while I was looking for this woman was the story of Josie Dunn. Josie is the woman on the left. She had a 8-year-old son named Arthur, and this is her husband, James. James was her second husband. She was a widow, and he had divorced his wife. He had children with his wife that were older than Arthur. He had a son named Clayton who was 18. And Josie and him had met and married, and Josie had got a house on Summit Avenue, right by where, or Summit Street, by where Swedish American is located. So he moved in there with her, James did. In July of 1925, Josie's mother, who was from Ireland and very superstitious, had a series of horrible dreams where she would be standing by water and she would hear Josie yelling, "Help me, Mama." And she was haunted by these dreams for a few days. On July 6th of 1925, a woman's body washed up in the river about where the Rockford Country Club was located. It is located now. Nobody knew who she was, so they took her out of the river. Her face was covered with mud, and she had a long skirt on that was torn, but in the pocket of the skirt, she had a prayer book and a rosary. They took her, they had to do something rather unorthodox. They took her to the coroner's offices and laid her out. Again, this would have been Fred C. Olson was the coroner. And they had the Catholic priests in town come by. And one of them actually recognized Josie. So said that her name was Josie. She wasn't as active now, but she had been very active. So part of the police officers were still on the banks of the river, and they found a blanket and a picnic basket and a pair of women's shoes and a letter that said, "Under the dark blue waters, you will find me." So that was going on. The identification of her body was going on. And then after they went to Josie's house, they called her husband at work and told him what had happened, that they had found Josie. They went into the home and they said it was very eerie. They knew that the woman's body was laying waiting for autopsy, and they're in this home that looked like somebody had just left. They talked to the neighbors and they said Josie had been home that morning and everything was fine. Or, this was the first time that they heard that Josie had a son. That Arthur had been playing in the yard. Josie called him, and then they were all dressed up and they left together with a picnic basket. They went to speak to Josie's mother, and that's when she told them that she had a feeling that something bad had happened. She had a particularly nasty dream on the night prior to this. And she had been trying to phone Josie all day. She just felt like something awful was going to happen. They started to look for Arthur's body because they didn't know where he would have been. They checked with his friends, they checked with family members. Nobody had seen him. The next day, they found his body, and these are the headlines from that. Josie had left in her letter that when they went into the house, they found a letter by her another prayer book on the table. And it said to James, it was addressed to James. And this is what it said. And she was going to take Arthur with him so he wouldn't have any burdens. And they questioned James about why would she do this. And he said he had no clue that this was going to happen, that this was the happiest time of his entire life. And he thought that Josie felt the same. Some boys who were caddies for the Rockford Country Club found little Arthur's body. The boy that jumped in to save him, or at the time they were hoping they could save him, wasn't much older than he was. And he was 13, the boy that brought him out. So the coroner came back out and bundled up the little body and took him back to his offices. And when they did his autopsy, he had marks from his own fingernails. And they came to the horrific conclusion that Josie had taken him to the Harlem Park that day. It was one of his favorite places to go. They had ridden on a couple rides and they had lunch there by the river. And she suggested that maybe he go into the river wading. And she went in after him and she held him under the water. And he had tried to get her to let him go. This story is hard to tell, obviously. It's hard to tell. But this story, I was doing some stories at a Kiwanis breakfast, and a man came up to me. I hadn't told any stories yet. He just introduced himself, and then he said, "I have a story for you." And I said, "You do?" And he said, "Yes." And he said he was sleeping one night, and for some reason, he woke up. And there in the darkness of his bedroom, he looked at the end of his bed, and it had a kind of a glow, and he saw a little boy. And he said he wasn't scared. He just saw this little boy and he tried to make sure he was seeing things and he was awake and he wasn't dreaming. And as he watched the boy said something, but he couldn't understand what he said. And then out of the darkness behind the little boy came a hand, and it landed on the boy's shoulder. And then a woman appeared behind him. And then she pulled the boy back into the darkness. The man looked at me and he said, "Do you know of any stories that might be?" And I said, "Well, maybe." I said, "Where do you live?" And he said, "I live by the Rockford Country Club." Josie automatically popped into my head. I don't know if Josie is the woman in white, but she sure fits a lot of what the folklore says of a woman, a weeping woman. I don't know how many people have seen her. I just know that I've gotten a lot of reports about this woman who's walking by the river and she seems to be searching for something. And whether it's the guilt that keeps her walking, because she knows that she said that in the paper, in another letter that she had written, that God could forgive her. And maybe God can forgive for that. But I don't think Josie's forgiven herself. And I think that keeps her walking the river, searching for Arthur. Okay. So, that one is a hard one to tell. Unfortunately, when you're looking at who this could be downtown, there are several women who have not taken a child with them, but they have drowned themselves in the river. And so I don't know if that's what it is. There was a story a few years ago. I got a phone call from Kristen Crowley on the TV, and she wanted me to come, and she was going to meet me and interview me. There was a call into Rockford Scanner. I mean, I guess it was a police call that came in, and it was covered on Rockford Scanner, and they released it. And the report said that somebody downtown, there is a parking garage that's like 7 stories, and across Beatty Park, there is a high-rise, and an apartment high-rise. And somebody in that apartment had seen a woman riding up and down the elevator. This is in the middle of the night, and she's wearing a long white gown, and she looks like she has her hair up in a bun. So the police officers showed up, and they knew it was a parking deck that had multiple floors. So a couple of them showed up, and they said they could see the woman riding up and down, or up, and the caller was still on the line, and they said they could see the elevator going up, but they didn't see anybody in it, but the caller could see this woman as plain as day. So they never solved that one, but I was able to tell Kristen that, yeah, there was this story about her. She's seen it in the Coronado Theater too, so she's all over downtown. But that when you're there in the middle of the night by the elevator, it does kind of creep you out in that place. So another place that's kind of creepy in the middle of the night is the news tower downtown of Rockford. Now, the news tower, our paper is like over 160 years old now. It's changed a lot in its time. I don't even know where they're printing it these days, but at the time I started doing these tours, I've been doing haunted Rockford tours for 16 years this fall. And at the time that I was doing them, it was a real active place. There is a beautiful apartment that was built for the owners at the time, and we would go in there and tour it. One of the employees, I won't mention their name because I don't know if they're still there or not. One of the employees there was kind enough to tell me all about it, take us up, and take a group of us up in there. And it was kind of funny because she said sometimes the ghosts in the tower like to mess with her when she's in the elevator, and I'll be darned if that darn elevator didn't stop. And she kind of giggled about that. She said that she probably had the most experiences because at the time, it used to be there was a lot of offices on multiple floors of the tower. But by that time, most of them were just storage rooms. And there was a television theater up there studio that they would film things in, and that was no longer in use. And it seemed like when she went up to get supplies, then these ghosts would mess with her. One of the ghosts, this is not an actual picture of the ghost, by the way. One of the ghosts, she said she would hear things, sometimes like things were being knocked off of shelves in these rooms that were used for storage. Usually she'd open the door and then something would fall. She also heard this weird swishing noise, and at first she wasn't sure what it was. She thought maybe they were dragging something, but then as she listened, she thought, yeah, it sounds like somebody sweeping, like with one of those big brooms, they were sweeping the floor. She said sometimes when she would go up there, it would feel different. And there was one room one of the offices that had a glass part of the door. And she said she went upstairs and she thought, the hair on her arms rose up, and she thought, this feels different. And she got to this particular door, and on the other side of the door, even though she knew that there was nobody up there with her, there was a silhouette of a man. And she said, nope, it just felt weird. It looked weird. And she said that was enough for her, and she went back down. Now, she didn't scare easy after years of this. So, but she said that one felt different. So she did go down for that one. A couple people that they think could be haunting. One is a woman that is seen there. One of the people who owned the paper at one time was Ruth McCormick. You'll recognize the McCormick name for like the McCormick Camp McCormick down the Girl Scout camp down on Route 2. This is Ruth and her husband, Medill McCormick. They were heavy hitters. He especially, he was a senator, and his family was they were the McCormicks from Chicago, and they had the McCormick Place and all that stuff. So he was from a family that had a lot of money, and so was she. He was born in Chicago. He came down here on a hunting trip, and he fell in love with our area, and he bought some land around Oregon. And he was the editor and publisher of the Chicago Tribune at that time. And it seemed to everybody he had everything. He came from money, and he grew up with all the advantages that brings. He went to Yale, and he met a very beautiful woman, Ruth Hanna. Now, Ruth had a really close friend. Her best friend was Alice Roosevelt. So when the two of them married, Alice was accompanied by her father, Teddy, and they went to their wedding. I mean, not very many of us can say that. Medill's star continued to climb with his wife's help, but that success came at a price. Medill was not naturally outgoing. He had, as he got older especially, he had some problems with drinking. He would drink because it made him feel calmer in front of all the groups of people. He was living in Washington, and Ruth was handling the farm, the Rock River Farms down on the Route 2. And so he struggled with depression, and he struggled with alcoholism. And in 1925, Medill lost the GOP nomination to Charles Deanan. And on February 25th, 1925, just before the end of his term, and he would have been coming home, McCormick committed suicide in his hotel room. Ruth was devastated by the loss of her husband, especially in such a horrible way. And it was his wishes that he would be buried in a small churchyard down toward Route 2. It's actually on Montague Road. That's where he's buried, in this little tiny churchyard, this senator. Except this isn't really where she buried him at first. This is where she buried him at first. She actually bought 4 acres of land next to Middle Creek Church and paid $175,000 in 1925 to build this tomb. And Ruth carried on without her husband. She raised their 3 children. She put Rock River Farms on the map by growing one of the finest herds of Holsteins in the state. Her daughter started raising horses. They became known for that. But Ruth also picked up where Medill left off in politics. And in 1929, she sought the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate against the man that had beaten her husband. And she won. With the endorsement of the Chicago Mayor, Big Bill Thompson, Ruth avenged her husband's death by getting that nomination. She didn't receive, she was eventually defeated. She got the party nomination for the Senate, but then she was defeated in the actual election. She continued to impress everyone who met her. And she would eventually donate the land to the Girl Scouts for their camp. She would marry another senator and move out to New Mexico. Her beloved son had a horrible climbing accident and died young. And Ruth herself died in 1945 or 44 in a car accident on December 30th. So she's not buried with Medill. Now, what happened was a lot of people would come, and this was a local teen hangout. They would, smoke cigarettes, drink beer, leave all the debris behind. So eventually they moved Medell from this beautiful tomb up into the regular churchyard. And that is where he was laid to rest. Now, so they say there's this legend. They say that if you go and you knock on, he has a big metal door with his name on it where this tomb is at. And if you go and knock on this door, people will say he'll knock back. I don't know about that. He's never knocked back when I've done it. It is on church property, so just be respectful, and be respectful of all the cemeteries that you may visit in your time. Just remember, you know, you wouldn't want somebody tromping on your grandmother's grave. So if you do visit a cemetery, well, especially during Halloween, but at all times be respectful. The last story I'm going to share with you is the Barnes Mansion. Now, most people won't know it by the name Barnes Mansion. It is next to the Burpee Natural History Museum. That was the Manny Mansion at one time. And next to it, if you're looking at the road from North Main and you're looking at the museum, it's the building to the left. And it was built in 1893 by William Barnes Fletcher. And he came to Rockford in the 1850s with his brothers, and they noticed that Rockford was wonderful with the manufacturing, and they had the idea, instead of building another manufacturing plant, they would build a factory to make the tools that they would use to make the furniture. So they were able to, in 1893, Rockford went through a really bad recession, and they were able to build this beautiful house using hired carpenters and men who are out of work. So it helped the economy, and it helped these men too. So here's another picture without all the leaves on the tree. It's a beautiful home. The cupola it's really cool to go up in there. When I first found this story, I interviewed people. I had done a story about the Manny Mansion, and I interviewed the director at the time of the Burpee Museum. And she let me go in. She had only been a director for a short time. And I got to climb in all the hidey holes, and it was a pretty cool investigation, kind of. I will tell you, I had we hosted some public investigations there, but usually before we do a public investigation, we do a kind of a private one just to see what we might see or hear or whatever. As we were doing the walkthrough to figure out where to put everything, because it had never been investigated, one of the investigation teams, the lead person was a very attractive female. And as we were standing in the hallway, she was bent over and she flipped around really quick. And I thought she was going to slug the guy that was with us. I was taking notes, but she flipped around and she said, "What did you do that for?" And he said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you blew on the back of my neck." She said, "That's not funny." And I had been there right with him, and he didn't do that. Later on, when we brought the psychics to do their walkthrough, they said there used to be a man that was probably a maintenance man or like a gardener there. And sometimes he would catch the young women alone, especially if they were in an area where the servants were at, or the psychic had seen in her mind's eye a scene where the girl was putting things up in a linen closet, and he came up behind her and groped her, and she didn't enjoy it. And so there was that predator feeling there. But she said that, he thought he was a real Casanova, but he was just kind of a creep. So the part of the story is there's a little bit of mystery. Fletcher's oldest son, Joseph, who was right there with his father building, he supposedly got tuberculosis, and they had him in a sick room in the basement. And one of the psychics said that she picked up a lot of blood. He would have been coughing up a lot of blood in the sick room. The basement is particularly creepy. They have some storage things down there. I did at the time. I don't know now, but it was kind of creepy. They had a kitchen down there, and then the storage room where Joseph would breathe his last. And again, this family suffered, like every other family, deaths of family members. And there's a picture of William Fletcher. It gets really confusing because he had a son named William Fletcher and then a grandson named William Fletcher. So, but this William Fletcher was the head of the family, and this is his wife, Julia, Catherine Gould. There was another tragedy. Catherine and Fletcher were like top of the social ladder here in Rockford. And she had gone up north camping with some friends. And for some reason, she was sitting in the woods and there were hunters. And one of them actually shot her. And some of the bird shot that came through lodged in her face, and one of them lodged in her eye, and it went blind, and she went blind in the eye. She didn't die from the wound, but it was a very disfiguring accident. And she was considered a beauty, and she was so smart. She wrote for magazines, and she really helped African Americans and women rights here in Rockford. So this woman had it going on. But after this accident, she really kind of missed that. She didn't feel like she should. She got confused. She got horrible, horrible headaches where she couldn't function. So it really changed their entire life after this accident. So Julia is one of the spirits in the house. The house there on the second floor has a rounded window, and Julia is seen in this window. She stands there, and she used to be the place where everybody would come and gather, and then she would just stand there and watching Rockford go by without her. And it was very, very sad. One of the ghost stories that was really instrumental for me to gather. I was very excited about this particular story. There was, these are the offices of the administration offices for the museum, but they were doing something in the museum, and it was pretty late at night. So the one person was in the office that's on the first floor, and the activities director had her office on the second floor. And when the woman was on the first floor, she could hear music playing, and she figured that the activities director was upstairs. And she got done with her work, and she figured she'd go up and see if the young lady was ready to go, because so they could leave together. Obviously, it's safer to leave in pairs. So she heard the music playing, and she thought, oh, that's nice. So she ran up the stairs, and it's a winding stairway, beautifully crafted, by the way. She ran up the stairs, and the lights were off up there in the hallway where the offices were, and she thought that was strange. They had the little lights that stay on all the time in the hallway, but the light to the actual office wasn't on. And she called out the girl's name, and there was no answer, but the music kept playing, and she thought, okay, that's weird. So she walked to the office, and just as she stepped across the threshold, the music stopped, and there was nobody in that office. And she decided it was time for her to go. She ran downstairs and gathered her things and left. And she said she turned off the lights, and she set the alarm code, and went to her car, and her car was parked in the front of that house. And as she opened her car, she looked up, and the curtain slowly fell back down, like somebody had been holding it open, watching her walk to the car. And then the lights turned on in the house. And she said she just got the feeling like they were wanting her to go, that they're ready to have their house back for them. And they turned the lights back on, so that they could, it's like, okay, your time with this house is done now, it's our time. I find this happens a lot in these beautiful mansions that Rockford has. Tinker is the same way. The Briggs Mansion was the same way. And the families that built these houses just loved them so much. And they're not there to scare anybody. The creepy guy, the creepy stalker guy is not fun. But the basic feeling in this house, it's startling when you have somebody touch you or you hear voices. So don't get me wrong, but it's not anybody who's out to hurt you. Basically they want to let you know they're still there. And I love the fact that I get to tell their stories. And I know that they have shared, the Tinkers have shared that they like it when I tell their stories. So that these families are still in their house, doing what they've done. And, you know, a lot of them had a great legacy for Rockford, and the Barnes family is definitely one that gave a lot to Rockford. Well, I hope you enjoy these stories, and I hope you can go out and visit some of these places on your own, and get on my website. There's more places to share. There's more stories to share, more places to visit. And, you know, this year has been a tough year for us. I'm doing a cemetery tour Saturday night at Cedar Bluff, and then I'm doing a downtown walking tour. We are asking everyone to wear masks. And, you know, it just lets me share the Rockford's history. I'm hoping to get back to our big bus tours that we usually do in the fall. So just keep hoping for us, and keep reading my stories. And I hope you get a little bit of a spine-tingling feeling from them. Thank you to Nicole, for inviting me. I hope we can do other events together, and hopefully in person.
Thank you, Kathy, for that fascinating talk about our local area and some of the chilling crimes and unusual happenings here. And I want everyone to know that we do have Kathy's books in our library if you choose to read them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy Halloween, everyone.
Happy Halloween.